No one in Coaton County ever forgot the day Silas Ruddled offered his own daughter as payment, not for money, not for land, but for silence. In the summer of 1841, Cypress Grove Plantation stood like a monument to control, white columns gleaming, fields stretching endlessly toward the marsh, enslaved bodies bending beneath the Carolina sun. Silas Ruddled ruled it all with a kind of authority that came from wealth, connections, and a reputation that discouraged questions. But inside the grand house, behind shuttered windows and locked doors, there was one problem he could not control: his daughter. Catherine Ruddled was 23 years old and had never fit the mold her father demanded. She was larger than other women her age, soft where society expected sharpness, quiet where others were polished and charming. Marriage proposals had come and gone. Mothers whispered about her appetite. Men joked privately about her appearance. Silas did not see a daughter. He saw a liability. In a world where alliances were currency and daughters were bargaining tools, Catherine had failed to secure either. And then came the scandal. Rumors began circulating in nearby plantations, whispers that Silas's private gatherings were not strictly about business, that men disappeared, that certain enslaved workers were transferred quietly and never seen again, that strange deliveries arrived at night. Silas crushed rumors the way he crushed everything else, through intimidation, bribes, and carefully placed threats, until someone he did not expect began asking questions. Ezekiel Cross. Ezekiel had been born on Cypress Grove. Strong, intelligent, observant, he moved through the plantation quietly, rarely speaking unless spoken to. But he watched, he remembered. And recently, he had started connecting things. He had seen the ledger in Silas's study when delivering firewood, pages marked with names and symbols. He had noticed which enslaved men were taken to the cellar during certain meetings. He had watched grief ripple through the quarters afterward. Ezekiel did not confront Silas. He did something far more dangerous. He waited. Silas became aware of the shift almost immediately. Overseers reported that Ezekiel was asking subtle questions, that he had been seen speaking late at night with workers from neighboring fields, that his presence unsettled the others not through violence, but through thought. Silas understood threat when he saw it, and threats had to be neutralized. But Ezekiel was not like the others. He was respected. Strong. Calm. Removing him suddenly would raise suspicion, so Silas crafted a different solution, an arrangement so calculated it bordered on cruel brilliance. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the fields, Silas summoned Ezekiel to the main house. The invitation alone was unusual. Enslaved men did not sit in the master's study. But that night, Ezekiel stood inside the room lined with dark wood shelves and imported rugs. He did not bow deeply. He did not tremble. Silas noticed. "I hear you've been thinking," Silas began. "I always think," Ezekiel replied evenly. A faint smile flickered across Silas's face. "Good. Then you'll understand what I'm about to offer. Offer. Not threat, not command. Offer." Silas leaned back in his leather chair. "You're a valuable asset to this plantation. Strong. Intelligent. Loyal so far." Ezekiel remained silent. "I need loyalty," Silas continued. "And you need protection." "From what?" Ezekiel asked. Silas's gray eyes sharpened. "From curiosity." The air thickened. Silas stood and walked toward the window, overlooking the fields. "My daughter, Catherine, requires companionship." The statement hung strangely between them. Ezekiel did not react outwardly. Silas turned. "You will attend to her." It was phrased carefully. No crude detail. No explicit command, but the meaning was clear. Catherine was to be handed to him. Not as a wife. Not as an equal dot. As leverage, if you accept, Silas continued. Your position changes. You will work inside the house. Your family will be protected, certain privileges granted. And if I refuse? Ezekiel asked quietly. Silas's expression cooled. Then curiosity becomes dangerous. There it was. The choice was not a choice. Catherine, meanwhile, knew nothing of the negotiation happening downstairs. She sat alone in her upstairs bedroom, staring at her reflection in a mirror framed in gold leaf. She had overheard enough whispers in her life to understand her value or lack of it. When her father entered her room later that night, she recognized the look in his eyes. The transactional one. You will receive a companion, he told her flatly. Her stomach dropped. She knew better than to argue. Why? She asked softly. Because it is necessary. Necessary. That word defined her existence. Necessary for alliances. Necessary for appearances. Necessary for silence. The next morning, Catherine saw Ezekiel standing in the hallway outside her door. There, eyes met. In that single glance, something unspoken passed between them. He understood this was not kindness. She understood he had not volunteered. Two people trapped in the same cage, just different sides of it. And Silas watched from the stair, landing satisfied. He believed he had solved two problems at once. Neutralized a threat, contained a daughter, reasserted dominance. But power built on humiliation rarely ends cleanly. Because what Silas did not account for was this: when you force two wounded people into the same corner, they do not always break. Sometimes they plan. And in the quiet halls of Cypress Grove, beneath chandeliers and polished floors, something began to form. Not romance, not submission, but understanding. And understanding, in a house full of secrets, was the most dangerous thing of all. The first week was silence. Not the polite, distant quiet of strangers forced into proximity, but the tense, watchful silence of two people measuring each other inside a trap. Ezekiel was moved from the fields to the main house the morning after. Silas made his arrangement. The other enslaved workers noticed immediately. Promotions did not happen without reason, and they certainly did not happen quietly. Whispers followed him through the corridors. Inside the house, Catherine felt them. Two servants avoided her eyes. Her aunt stopped visiting her room. Even the housemaid who brushed her hair each morning suddenly worked in stiff, awkward movements. Everyone understood something had shifted, but no one said it aloud. Silas, meanwhile, behaved as though he had solved a business inconvenience. He invited associates to dinner. He laughed loudly at the head of the table. He began referring to Catherine as improving in company, as though her existence were part of a renovation project. Ezekiel remained careful. He spoke only when necessary. He followed orders precisely. He allowed Silas to believe the strategy was working. But in private, moments, brief ones, when Catherine dismissed servants and the doors were closed, the air changed. The first time they were alone without watchers, Catherine stood near the fireplace, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You don't have to pretend," she said. "I'm not pretending," Ezekiel replied. She searched his face for resentment, disgust, accusation. She found none. "You hate this," she said, double quotes. "Yes. Then why agree?" Ezekiel's jaw tightened. Because refusal would not have protected anyone. Her eyes flickered with understanding. That was the first crack in the arrangement. Over the next days, their conversations grew longer. Not intimate. Strategic. Catherine revealed things she had never told anyone. How her father had begun holding secret meetings in the cellar years ago. How certain enslaved workers vanished afterward. How she once found blood on the cellar steps and was told she had imagined it. She told him about the medicine her father forced her to take, tonics that made her foggy, forgetful, heavy. "I thought I was losing my mind," she admitted. "You weren't," Ezekiel said. He believed her. That belief alone changed something inside her. In return, Ezekiel spoke carefully about what he had observed. The ledger, the coded symbols, the pattern of disappearances. Catherine listened with growing horror. "My father isn't just cruel," she whispered one night. "He's hiding something." "Yes," Ezekiel said quietly, "and he thinks placing us together has secured his silence. Silas assumed proximity would break them. He miscalculated. Instead of turning against each other, they began studying the house together. Catherine knew hidden passages, old servant corridors built when the plantation was first constructed. She had explored them as a child before her father confined her movements. Ezekiel memorized every detail she described. The location of the cellar entrance, the schedule of gatherings, which nights certain carriages arrived after dark. Meanwhile, Silas grew comfortable. Too comfortable. He stopped monitoring Ezekiel as closely. The overseers reported no resistance, no escape attempts, no agitation among the enslaved workers. To Silas, that meant compliance. But compliance and calculation looked similar from a distance. 3 weeks into the arrangement, a gathering was announced. 13 men were expected. Catherine recognized the pattern immediately. "They will meet in the cellar," she said. Ezekiel nodded. "Do they always meet on the same schedule?" "Every 6 weeks. And afterward," she swallowed. "Someone disappears." The realization hung heavy between them. For the first time, Catherine understood the full weight of what had been happening beneath her bedroom for years. Her father hadn't been protecting reputation. He had been protecting something darker. Night. Ezekiel made a decision. "If we expose him without proof," he said, "we die." Catherine's hands trembled. "So what do? We gather evidence." "How?" He looked at her steadily. "You get invited to dinner tomorrow night." Silas had never included Catherine in his private gatherings. She was considered unstable. Embarrassing. But now, with Ezekiel visibly attached to her, Silas saw opportunity. If Catherine appeared more present, he would reinforce the illusion that his arrangement was successful. So when Catherine requested to attend dinner, Silas agreed. The dining room glittered with candlelight the next evening. Silverware, polished, wine flowing. 13 men seated around the table. Ezekiel stood against the wall, serving. Heedless, names were mentioned. Plantations discussed. Shipments referenced. But the real conversation happened in glances, in coded phrases, in references to harvest. Catherine forced herself to remain composed. She laughed when expected, nodded politely. But under the table, her hands clenched. At one point, Judge Pelham leaned towards Silas. "And the situation with your daughter?" he asked. Silas smiled thinly. "Handled," the men chuckled. Ezekiel felt his pulse steady, not race. Anger was useful only when controlled. After dinner, as the men moved toward the cellar entrance, Catherine did something unexpected. She stood. "Father," she said sweetly, "may I see the ledger you've been working on? I want to understand the accounts better." The room stilled. Silas studied her. She held his gaze. A test. Finally, he laughed dismissively. "Another night, Catherine," but she saw it. The flicker of caution. He did not want her near that book. which meant it mattered. Later, in her room, she closed the door and turned to Ezekiel. The ledger is the key. Yes. And he keeps it in the study. Yes. Silence. Stretched Dot. Then Catherine said something neither of them had fully acknowledged until that moment. If we're going to survive this, we can't just endure it. Ezekiel met her eyes. We end it. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. A storm gathering over Cypress Grove. Inside the house, beneath polished floors, an inherited pride. Two people Silas believed he controlled were no longer reacting. They were planning. And the next gathering would not go the way the brethren expected. The storm broke 2 nights before the next gathering. Rain lashed against the tall windows of Cypress Grove, wind rattling shutters that had not been properly secured in years. Lightning flashed across the rice fields, turning the world outside into a series of violent white images. Inside the main house, Silas Ruddled slept soundly. He believed control had been restored. He believed proximity had neutralized threat. He believed fear was still the most powerful force under his roof. He was wrong. In Catherine's room, a single candle burned low. Ezekiel stood near the door, listening for footsteps in the corridor. Catherine sat at her desk, staring at the blank page in front of her. If we take the ledger, she whispered, we expose him. If we take it too early, Ezekiel replied, we disappear. Silas's study was always locked. The key never left his waistcoat during gatherings, but Catherine knew something Silas did not realize she knew. Years ago, when she was still allowed to roam the house freely, she had discovered a narrow service passage behind the east hallway paneling. It ran parallel to the study wall and connected to the cellar's staircase. The servants once used it. Silas had forgotten it existed. The gathering would take place in 2 nights. 13 men would arrive after sunset. The ledger would be present. And for the first time, Catherine would not be upstairs, pretending not to hear what happened below. The plan was simple, which meant it was dangerous. On the night of the gathering, Catherine would excuse herself early, claiming a headache. Silas would expect it. He preferred her unseen when business was conducted. Ezekiel would be assigned to serve in the dining room. At the right moment, when wine had loosened tongues and attention shifted, he would slip away under the pretense of retrieving more bottles from the cellar stores. Catherine would already be in the passage. The ledger would be removed, not stolen permanently. Copied. They needed evidence, not disappearance. Because disappearance would trigger retaliation. They needed doubt. Doubt was slower, more corrosive, and far more powerful. The night arrived heavy and humid. Carriages rolled down the long dirt drive one by one. 30 men stepped inside the main house, greeted by candlelight and polished courtesy. Catherine wore a pale blue dress she had not worn in years. It strained slightly at the waist, but she stood straighter than she ever had before. Silas noticed. He interpreted her posture as gratitude, not defiance. Dinner unfolded as usual. Laughter too loud. Voices too confident. Wine poured freely. Ezekiel moved silently between chairs, refilling glasses, memorizing every word. Alabama, Shipmans. No loose ends this time. The swamp burial worked. Catherine kept her expression neutral, though her pulse hammered in her ears. At precisely 9 o'clock, she pressed a hand to her temple. Father, I'm unwell. Silas barely looked at her. Go rest. She curtsied lightly and left. No one stopped her. In the hallway, her breath changed. Faster. Sharper. She slipped behind the east paneling and into the narrow passageway. The air inside smelled of dust and old wood. Her candle flickered dangerously close to the wall. Below her, she could hear faint movement of men finishing dinner, chairs scraping. Soon they would descend. She reached the thin interior door that opened behind a shelf inside. Study. On the other side, the ledger waited. Ezekiel timed his exit carefully, as Judge Pelham launched into a story about a court case, manipulated in their favor. Ezekiel leaned toward Silas. More wine from the cellar, sir? Silas waved dismissively. Yes. The good bottle. Ezekiel moved quickly but without urgency. Down the hall, into the study. He closed the door softly behind him, and for a moment the room felt impossibly loud. Ticking clock, distant laughter, footsteps shifting overhead. He moved to the desk. The ledger sat exactly where Catherine had said it would be. Thick, leather-bound, heavy with consequence. He opened it. Names, dates, symbols, amounts of money exchanged. Entries marked with small, carved symbols beside certain names. Those names were the missing ones. He heard a faint tap. 3 quick knocks. The signal. He crossed to the bookshelf, pressed against the back panel, and it shifted inward just enough for Catherine's hand to appear. Their eyes met through the narrow opening. He passed the ledger through. She disappeared, back into darkness. Ezekiel replaced it with a decoy ledger. Catherine had prepared weeks earlier blank pages, filled with meaningless account figures, copied from older plantation books. Close enough to avoid immediate suspicion, different enough to matter later. He returned to the dining room moments before the men began moving toward the cellar. No one questioned him. In the passageway, Catherine's hands shook as she hurried toward her room. She hid the ledger beneath loose floorboards she had pried up days earlier. Then she waited. Below her, muffled voices rose and fell as the gathering began. Chants, low discussion, occasional laughter. Her stomach twisted. Every sound confirmed what she already knew. The ledger wasn't rumor, it was proof. Hours later, the men emerged. Satisfied. Untouchable. Silas returned to his study briefly before retiring for the night. He opened the ledger, flipped through pages. Paused. Something felt different. But wine-dulled precision. He closed it again. Satisfied enough. The next morning, Catherine and Ezekiel sat across from each other in her room. The ledger lay open between them. Sunlight illuminated every name, every transaction, every coded reference. It's worse than we thought, Catherine whispered. Yes, she traced a symbol beside an entry from 3 years ago. That's the year Sarah disappeared. Ezekiel nodded. And Benjamin, her hand trembled. If we expose this publicly, we die, he said calmly. She swallowed. Then what? He leaned forward. We don't expose it yet. Her eyes lifted to his. We make them turn on each other. Outside, the plantation stirred as if nothing had changed. Fields worked. Meals prepared. Orders given. But inside the main house, the first fracture had formed. Silas believed he still commanded fear. He did not yet understand that fear had shifted. And once fear changes direction, power follows. The first fracture appeared quietly, not in the cellar, not in the fields, but at breakfast. Silas sat at the head of the long mahogany table, unfolding a letter delivered at dawn. Judge Pelham had sent it by courier. Marked urgent. Silas read it once. Then again. His jaw tightened. Across the table, Catherine watched, without appearing to watch. What is it, father? She asked carefully. Silas folded the letter. Business disagreement, but his voice had lost its usual smoothness. Later, that morning, Another rider arrived. Then another dot. By noon, 3 separate letters had been delivered to Cypress Grove, each from a different member of the Brethren. Each questioning the ledger, not accusing not directly, but asking about discrepancies. Certain entries didn't align with personal records. Certain payments seemed certain coded marks appeared where they shouldn't. Small inconsistencies. Precise inconsistencies. Ezekiel had not altered, much only enough. Just enough to introduce doubt. And doubt spreads faster than fear. By afternoon, Silas locked himself inside his study. He flipped through the ledger repeatedly, brow furrowed. He prided himself on precision. The Brethren functioned because every record was exact, every secret accounted for. Now something felt off. Not catastrophic, but wrong. He sent word for a private meeting that evening, smaller than usual, only 5 of the 13. Inside the cellar, voices rose sharper than before. You assured us the records were secure. Marik sufaningu sinapudo. They are, Silas insisted. Then explain why my payment from February is recorded twice. Because it was, Silas replied evenly. It was not. A pause. Judge Pelham's voice cut in, colder. We have survived this long because we do not tolerate sloppiness. Are you implying I am sloppy? Silas asked quietly. I'm implying, Pelham said, that something is shifting. The word hung between them. Shifting. Silas dismissed the meeting with forced composure, but for the first time in years, he did not feel absolute control. Above them, Catherine stood in the hidden passage, listening. She didn't need to hear every word. Tone was enough. Seeds had been planted back in her room later that night. She faced Ezekiel. They're turning, she whispered. Not yet, he said. They're suspicious. Suspicion must become paranoia, she swallowed. And how do we do that? Ezekiel opened the ledger again. We give each of them a reason to believe someone else is leaking. Over the next week, anonymous notes began, appearing. One slipped beneath Judge Pelham's door. Your February payment was noted twice. Ask Silas why. Another delivered to Reverend Crenshaw. The swamp burial wasn't as discreet as you believed. Each message contained just enough truth to be credible. Never signed. Never traced. Silas noticed the shift immediately. Men who once spoke confidently now glanced over shoulders. Meetings shortened, voices lowered. The Brethren had always trusted one thing above all else: secrecy. Now secrecy felt unstable. Silas confronted Catherine one evening unexpectedly. You've been different, he observed. Is that not what you wanted? She replied calmly. His eyes searched her face for weakness. He found composure instead. You seem clearer. I stopped taking the tonics, she said quietly. Silas stilled. That was not your decision to make. It is now, for a brief second. Something dangerous flickered across his face, but he controlled it. He always. D.I.D. You are improving because of my decisions, he said smoothly. Do not forget that. I won't, she answered, but her tone held something new. This that unsettled him more than defiance would have. Meanwhile, the enslaved quarters hummed with subtle change. Ezekiel had begun speaking quietly with trusted workers, not about revolt, about readiness. If something happens, he told them carefully, you must know which doors lead out, which horses are fastest, where the tools are kept. They did not ask questions. They understood enough. Then came the breaking point. At the next scheduled gathering, only 10 men arrived. 3 claimed illness. One sent word that he would no longer attend meetings at Cypress Grove. Silas read the note in silence. The brethren had never fractured before. Never inside the cellar, tension coiled like wire. "We are being watched," Reverend Crenshaw muttered. "By whom?" "She'd demandito perhaps," Pelham said carefully. From within, the accusation was subtle, but it landed. Silas's mind moved rapidly. Only a handful of people had access to the study. Servants, house staff. Catherine sought his gaze, sharpened above. Catherine felt it like a shift in weather. He was beginning to suspect. That meant time was shortening. That night, she and Ezekiel faced reality. "He will search the house," she said. "Yes, if he finds the ledger, he won't, because the ledger was no longer under her floorboards." 2 days earlier, Ezekiel had moved it into the cellar itself, hidden beneath the altar's false base, where no member would think to search, because they believed the threat was external, never internal. Silas began interrogating staff the following morning. Questions sharp, eyes colder. 2 servants were whipped publicly for insubordination. Fear surged through the plantation again. But this time, fear did not silence. It hardened. Ezekiel watched silently as the punishment unfolded. Silas believed cruelty would restore order. He didn't understand. Cruelty had already begun to erode it. That evening, Catherine confronted Ezekiel with a realization that made her voice shake. "He won't stop," she said. "If suspicion continues, he will start removing people, one by one. Yes. And eventually, he'll reach us." "Yes." Silence stretched. Thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Again another storm approaching. "So what do we do?" she asked. Ezekiel's expression settled into something resolute. "We stop planting doubt. And we end it." The words felt heavier now, more final. She inhaled slowly. "The next gathering." "Yes." He looked toward the cellar entrance through the hallway window. "For the first time, they are afraid." Catherine followed his gaze. "And frightened men make mistakes." Below the polished floors of Cypress Grove, 13 chairs still stood, arranged in a circle. But now, those chairs felt less like thrones, and more like traps. The storm arrived, the same night. The brethren gathered. Lightning split the Georgia sky, illuminating Cypress Grove in violent flashes of white. Wind tore through the magnolias, bending branches like bowed heads before judgment. Inside the house, the servants moved quietly, too quietly. Silas stood at the top of the cellar stairs as the men arrived one by one, only 9 this time. 4 had withdrawn completely. The fracture was widening. Judge Pelham entered last, water dripping from his coat. His eyes didn't greet Silas with warmth. They assessed him, measured him, doubted him. The cellar door shut. Candles flickered along the stone walls, shadows stretching long and distorted. Silas began the meeting immediately. "We have been compromised," he said. "Someone among us is attempting to weaken this order." Marcus Fanning scoffed. "That's obvious. Then let us speak plainly," Pelham said. "The records." Silas brought the ledger forward and placed it on the altar table. "This book is the foundation of everything we've built. If you doubt it, inspect it." He pushed it forward. Pelham stepped closer. He opened the ledger slowly, flipping through pages, scanning columns. Then he paused. "There are additions here," he said quietly. Silas's eyes narrowed. "Additions. Codes I do not recognize." Another man leaned in. "Nor." Silas grabbed the book. His expression shifted. Not panic, confusion. Because the codes weren't there before. Ezekiel had waited until that afternoon. One final insertion. One final spark. The room grew colder. You assured us this book was secure, Pelham said. It is, Silas snapped. Then explain this. Voices began rising. Accusations layered over suspicion. Perhaps you've been skimming, or protecting someone, or preparing to abandon us. Silas slammed his fist against the altar. I built this network, and perhaps, Pelham said slowly, you intend to control it alone. Silence followed. Dot heavy, dangerous. Dot for the first time. Silas was not directing the fear. He was inside it. Dot above them. Catherine stood in the passage with Ezekiel beside her. This is it, she whispered. He nodded. In the cellar, Marcus Fanning stepped forward. We need new leadership. The words detonated. Shirasuste adoeti himu. Indi subarifu. You forget who you're speaking to. No, Marcus replied. We remember exactly. Judge Pelham closed the ledger deliberately. Until we determine the source of these irregularities, the Brethren is suspended. Suspended. Dot. The word cut deeper than any insult. Silas's authority frozen, stripped of certainty. And in that suspended moment, something else happened. From outside the cellar, a sound echoed through the storm. Dot hooves. Multiple. Dot approaching. Fast! Dot. Every man in the room stiffened. Pelham turned toward the door. You said we were secure. Silas moved quickly to the stairs. When he opened the cellar door, wind rushed in, along with the unmistakable sight of lanterns bobbing through the rain. Sheriff's riders. More than a few. Someone had spoken. Panic ignited. Scatter! One man shouted. But scatter to where? They were underground. Trapped by their own secrecy. Silas turned toward the study, instinctively toward the ledger. But it was no longer in his hands. Because in the chaos below, Catherine descended the cellar steps. Every man froze at the sight of her. Wet hair. Calm eyes. No fear. Behind her stood Ezekiel. Silas's world shifted in a single second. You, he breathed. Catherine stepped fully into the candlelight. It was never the ledger you should have feared losing, she said, softly. It was control. The sheriff's men pounded at the front door upstairs. Wood splintered. The Brethren began shouting over each other. You brought this upon us. You betrayed us. Silas looked at Ezekiel, and for the first time, he saw not property, strategy, not obedience, but authorship. You orchestrated this, Silas said. Ezekiel did not answer. He didn't need to. Gathera spoke instead. You taught me how power works, she said to her father. You just never imagined I would learn it. The front door shattered above them. Boots thundered through the house. Pelham turned pale. If we are exposed, you already are, Catherine replied. Because earlier that week, copies of selected pages had been sent anonymously to federal authorities investigating illegal slave trading networks. Not everything, just enough to ensure attention. Enough to force scrutiny. The cellar door burst open as deputies flooded the staircase. Guns drawn. Orders shouted. Men scrambled. Some attempted to flee through the hidden swamp exit, but it had been sealed hours earlier. Ezekiel's work. Silas stood still as iron. Cuffs closed around his wrists. He did not resist. His eyes never left Catherine. You think this ends well for you? He said quietly. She met his gaze steadily. It already has. Upstairs, chaos consumed the house. But outside, something extraordinary happened. The enslaved workers were not running. They were watching. watching as the men who controlled their lives were escorted out in chains, watching as secrecy collapsed, watching as fear shifted direction. Rain washed across the fields like a cleansing. Marcus Fanning attempted to bargain. Pelham attempted to threaten. None of it mattered. The ledger was evidence. The storm was witness. And the illusion of invincibility was over. As dawn began to rise faintly through the thinning clouds, Cypress Grove no longer felt like a fortress. It felt exposed. Silas was loaded into a wagon. He looked smaller, now, not physically, but structurally. His system had depended on silence, and silence had finally broken. Catherine stood on the porch beside Ezekiel. For a long moment, neither spoke. "It's done," she whispered. "No," Ezekiel said gently. "It's begun, because justice in 1850 did not arrive clean. Trials would follow. Resistance would follow. Consequences would ripple outward. But something irreversible had happened. The brethren had fallen, and the myth of untouchable power had cracked." Catherine inhaled deeply. For the first time in her life, the air felt unfiltered, not medicated, not dictated, not owned. She turned to Ezekiel. "What happens now?" He looked out across the fields, where workers stood in stunned silence. "Now," he said, "we decide what freedom looks like." The storm clouds drifted east. Sunlight touched the plantation in pale gold. Cypress Grove would never be the same, and neither would the people who had survived it. If this story gripped you, if it shocked you, if it made you question who truly holds power, make sure you subscribe, because the stories history tried to bury, we're just getting started.